I believe Mr. Monkey is a new visitor for our missionary story time.
Yes.
Does Mr. Monkey have a name?
Mr. Monkey?
I don't know. I think
his name should be Eat. What do y'all think?
Sure.
If you think his name needs to be Eat, put a thumbs up. All right.
Sergeant Flynn is the leader of men. Sergeant Flynn always shouts attention. Attention! Here comes Mr. Geyser. He's older and he's wiser, reading Bible verses every day. Jesus wept! Jesus wept! Jesus wept! Here comes Mr. Geyser. He's older and he's wiser, read the Bible with him today. Jesus wept! Jesus wept! Jesus wept!
All right, well, let's hop into our missionary story. Who's excited?
Me.
Me too. Who are we learning about?
Amy Carmichael!
Right.
Amy Carmichael. Where is she a missionary to? Anybody remember where she's a missionary to? Sammy. India. She's a missionary to India, and what is she doing in India? Davy. Saving kids. Where is she saving them from?
Oh.
Otto.
The Indian temples.
The Hindu temples, very good, because there those children were being kept against their will, and they were being tortured and made to be servants and slaves. So that's some of what we talked about. Last week we talked about how she was able to how she was able to get some teachers to come help her with the children. Well, God was working in a big way among these children, and more children were coming. But with the more children came even more problems. We talked about how she struggled needing money, but I forgot to mention last week, she never asked for money. She just prayed, and God would always provide her needs and the needs of the children. But she needed teachers, and God provided teachers. But now she needs doctors, nurses, or maybe even a hospital. Anytime a child became sick, they had to go a long distance to be able to get medical attention. They had to walk or ride in a bandy cart. And this was a very hard form of travel, especially on a sick child. Can you imagine if you were sick with a high fever and not feeling well, and having to be walked or carried for a long distance? That would be very hard, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Amy understood that they desperately needed to have nurses or doctors come and help. She began to pray for this. And as she was praying for this, something new came. A new, what some might call, problem. Because one day, when Amy walked outside, there was a child sitting on the porch of the Donover house. That might not sound like a big problem, because this happened often. But this child was different than any other child she'd received before. This child was deaf. This child couldn't hear anything. Amy didn't care if the child was deaf. She knew this child needed to be loved, and that this child was loved by God. So she took that baby in and began to care for it. Short time later, more children began to show up. Sometimes parents would leave their children when the child was unhealthy. If the child had trouble walking or had some other disability and were unable to learn as other children learned, many of these children with special needs were left at Amy's doorstep for her to care for them. Amy knew that God wanted to care for these children, and that that God had a plan for each and every one of these children. So she began to once again do what? What do y'all think she did? What do you think, Davy?
Learn sign language.
Learn sign language? Nope, that's not what she did. But she wanted someone who could speak in sign language. So she began to pray for another teacher. And God provided a young woman who had gone to school to learn sign language. And she came to help Amy with the deaf children. God also began to provide nurses. Once again, she prayed and asked God to provide their needs. And He did. As a result, as they began to get more and more nurses, Amy realized that they needed something else. They needed a hospital. Somewhere close by that these children could get not only basic needs of medicine, but they could have a doctor who cared for and took care of them. And Amy began once again to pray and ask for God's help. Looks like E.E. ran away. There you are, E.E. Hi. Don't run off now. We're learning a lesson about missionaries. Now, the next thing that happened, they began to pray and ask God to provide their needs for a hospital. Little by little, God sent money to them. She, like I said, she never asked for money, but she would receive random gifts from people that allowed them to begin to build a hospital. Now, when they first decided to start their hospital, where do you guess they started it? Think about it. You're never going to guess. You'll never get it. Where do you think it started, Sammy?
Where they were.
Where they were. They're at Dohnavur, but they had to put it in a building. So what do you think that building was?
The church building?
No.
Is it Missionary building?
What?
Is it Missionary building?
No.
Oh.
But I'm going to tell you because you will never guess. They put it in a hen house.
Oh.
They took an old hen house and they made it into their hospital. They didn't have any electricity or anything like that, but it was enough to get them started. And as God provided more money, they were slowly able to build an actual building for the hospital. And with that, Amy began to pray for something else. See, she began to pray for doctors because she knew that nurses are good and nurses are a huge help. But she needed someone who was able to diagnose and help these children on a deeper level. And so they prayed for doctors. And guess what God did? What do you think, Davy? Sammy, what do you think?
She got the doctors.
God provided doctors. He provided 2 doctors. They had actually been called to China as missionaries. Who remembers where Amy started as a missionary? She wanted to go to China, ended up in Japan, went back to China, and then went to India, where she is now. Good job, kids. Y'all listen so well. And so these 2 young men were brothers, and they had gone to China to be missionaries. But on their way to China, they passed through India, and they met Amy. Amy was immediately touched by their excitement for the Lord and by their knowledge, their medical knowledge, and she knew she desperately needed doctors, but she also thought it would be wrong of her to ask God to send those 2 men to work with her, because wouldn't that be a little bit like coveting her neighbor's manservant? Because God had sent these men to serve in China. So she determined that she wouldn't pray for these men to stay there and work in her mission with her and her friends, but she would pray and ask God to provide different doctors. But God had a plan. He wanted these 2 young men to work in the mission there at Dohnavur and at the hospital there at Dohnavur. They started in China much like she had, and they too became very sick and were told they needed to find a different climate if they wanted to continue as missionaries. And both of them immediately thought of Dohnavur. God opened the door and they walked through it and began to serve there at the hospital. This was an exciting time for Amy, but there were other problems that she began to notice. One of which was that there was also little boys being sold to the temple. We've talked all about little girls being sold to the temples, but there were also little boys being sold to the temple. And Amy knew that this was also very sad, but she didn't know what she could do. She was already stretched so thin. She felt like she couldn't take on any more work. But one day, there was a knock on her door. Come on, kiddos, knock with me. She answered the door, and guess what it was? Okay, Otto, that's enough knocking. Don't hurt your nose. Anyways, she opened the door, and guess what it was? It was an Indian man who had been working with her for a while, and he told her that he'd found a baby that needed to be rescued. This baby was different than all the other babies. It was a little boy. And Amy knew then that God surely wanted her to help with the little boys in India who are also being sold to the temple. God had brought those two young men as missionaries, so not only were they able to run the hospital, but they were able to start a boys' home where they began to help little boys who'd been sold to the temple. God was opening doors and God was saving lives. At this point in Amy's life, she had 500 girls in her girls' home and 80 boys in the boys' home. Now, isn't that amazing what God is doing in India with Amy Carmichael?
That's a lot of kids.
It is a lot of kids. And it all started with one woman being willing to do what God told her to do in helping one little girl named Pearl Eyes.
Right.
It all started by rescuing one little girl. Now next week, I have a super exciting story for y'all. And you're never going to guess what it's about.
I'm on the edge of my seat waiting.
Well, you need to be, because it's the most dangerous story that we've told so far.
Gunfight?
It has to do with a robber and a thief.
Alright.
But you'll have to tune in next week if you want to hear it. Bye-bye.
Auf Wiedersehen!